to Koeberg to extend the life by 20 years, and further delays on Unit 2, which is still to follow. So the question he poses is, what lessons can be learned from the world's nuclear superpowers that could assist Eskom to get these upgrades at Koeberg done effectively and safely?
Right. You want to take that question?
Yes, thank you. We have seen a lot of these steam generator replacement projects taking place over the world, in particular in France. So this is nothing new, but we should not confuse the problems of Eskom with nuclear being problematic. I think what we are seeing at Koeberg is, and this was said to me by people at Koeberg, it's a result of two things: poor project management and poor contract management. And the lessons are there. They know. They have visited all these plants in France that have carried out these upgrades, steam generator replacement projects. But apparently and quite clearly, the lessons were not learned that well. So it is an organizational problem, and I think it shouldn't be interpreted as an industry-wide problem.
Right, thank you for that. Craig, let's nominate an online participant to ask in person.
We have a Zakeli Madela.
Zakeli Madela, please switch on your camera and ask your question. And if you can tell us where you're from, Zakeli, it will also be helpful.
Good afternoon. My name is Zakela Madela. I represent two organizations. One is South African Energy Forum, but I also represent the work stream of the Engineering League of Progress, which consists of around about 1,000 engineers in South Africa who have undertaken to work with the government across all the sectors. So my question really is around the presentation that's been delivered by Peter and Andy Kylie, a great presentation. But my two questions really quickly is, first of all, we have seen the activity around nuclear around the world. I'm getting the impression that South Africa is being asked to fold its arms up until maybe in 15 years' time, the very same nations that are pursuing nuclear, they will come and sell nuclear to us. Can somebody answer on that? The second question that I want to ask, we were the leader of the SMR when we were running with the PBMR project. Most people, they are investing in SMRs. Here in South Africa, we're doing absolutely nothing. Can somebody make sense out of all of this? Thank you.
All right, thank you for that. And Jaco, can I acknowledge you in the room? So Jaco Kriek, the last CEO of the PBMR project, is in the room. So maybe we'll give him an opportunity to respond to that as well. Andy, you want to take that question on the skills and where we're going to go?
Yeah, so Zach's view is that South Africa is being asked by outside forces to wait 15 years. And my view on that is no, South Africa is not being asked to do that. In fact, right now, every of the major countries are struggling with their own energy transition in very profound ways. And I would say most countries could not care more or less whether South Africa adopted a nuclear program or not. I think the points that Mark Swilling made about the South African ability to, or either at Eskom level or the Treasury level, to absorb more debt is a significant issue. But only financiers will worry about that. But no, South Africa needs to make its own, to stand up and make its own decision in this regard. The rest of the world right now is minding its own business.
Right, thank you. Can you just give the mic to Mr. Jaco Kriek there at the back? And I have to declare my conflict of interest here. My mother's last name was also Kriek.
Is there a two-minute limit on me as well?
Well, we'll give you 2.5 minutes. Jaco.
Okay. Thank you, Wikus. So if I think back, and actually when I left, when PBMR stopped, I wrote a paper for myself. And there are a lot of lessons, a lot of mistakes we made as PBMR. We probably ramped up the company to 1,000 people too fast. We should have done what the US did with their program, their NGMP program. In fact, we worked for the US. We had a $40 million contract with the US. And PBMR, in terms of the fuel, it was tested in the US, tested in Russia. We had people chairing ASME committees. You know the universities that we were involved with in South Africa and abroad. And it was really a fantastic program. Yes, we made mistakes. It got expensive. 2008 financial crisis hit us. And then another bus hit us when President Mbeki left. And that was a fatal blow for us. So if I think back, and I signed a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese, who has now built their PBMR. By the way, they have a problem with their PBMR, the fuel loading system, fuel handling system. They were breaking the pebbles, and they were stopped. But during our time, we actually advised the Chinese, because our engineers said that their graphite will only last 4 years. We wrote to them, because the engineers asked me whether we should tell them. And I said, for sure, otherwise we're going to fail. So they didn't believe us, and eventually they came back to us, and we assisted them. So at that stage, my advice to the politicians, let's cooperate. Let them build it, pay for it, but we get the credit of a demonstration facility. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And yes, there are a lot of things we should have. We did make mistakes. We can't just blame it on the politicians. But I sometimes wake up at night and think if we had another chance, because it was just for South Africa, for intellectual property, for what Bismarck was saying. I helped him to go to the IAEA, and today he's a very knowledgeable nuclear person. And Dave Nichols was at PBMR. So fantastic team, 600 engineers working there. Anyway, so yes, I wish we made we made mistakes, but I wish the politicians also allowed us to cooperate and to continue. But money has dried up for the project at that stage, and money was necessary.
Thank you very much. Dave, I know you want to ask a question.
Thank you. Just a quick couple of comments. Just the first comment is that in terms of machines being built today, the trouble I have is that everyone looks at the US and the Europeans as to how to do it, and with due respect, they're completely screwing it up. And you've got to look carefully at the people who do it. And with all due respect, the people who are doing it are the Russians, the Chinese, and the Koreans. And if you look at all their export deals, they're essentially within reasonable scope, on fixed budgets and on schedule. There were some delays because of COVID, but essentially the export machines in the world today, if you buy an export machine as a fixed contract, and that was the negotiation in 2007. I'll also point out something I think is slightly more fundamental. We're talking about net zero by 2050. Unless you can make CC, carbon capture and storage, work, and quite bluntly, there's nobody in the world who's got anywhere close to a commercial discussion on that. And or if you can make batteries literally 1/8 the cost they are now, and that's almost impossible because we're now down to 85% of the cost being materials, then you end up with net zero being either large hydro or nuclear. Now you can argue in the meantime about a bit of natural gas here and a bit of natural gas there, but the evidence is natural gas is worse than coal because of methane leakage at 80 times that other thing. In terms of costing, I'll just comment, the last one is that the JET program, JET IP, is proudly going to spend 1.5 trillion rand between now and 2027. No one quite knows how to fund it or what it's being used for, but that is obviously affordable by the current thought process. Whereas 1 trillion rand, which is the quoted number for the 9.6 gigawatts, which is an open tender deal. We'd never gone to it. Spent over 15 years and fully funded by financing at 2% real interest rates is not affordable. I have a logic problem there. And my last comment is, if you put the right discount rate in the models of about 3%, you get a very different answer to the current model.
Okay, Mark, I'm sure you're going to answer that 1.2 trillion rand question. Where we're going to spend it and how we're going to spend it and how do you compare that?
Yeah, I mean, the 1.5 trillion referred to in the JET IP, 2023 to 2027, 28, the way, I mean, there's a secretariat that's been set up in the presidency that is working on that, but a small proportion of that is going to come from the International Partners Group, the 8.5 billion dollars, which is really only 150, only 10% of that total amount. So so everybody's focused on the viability of those external funds, but what they don't realize is what the cabinet did when they approved the JET IP and the 1.5 trillion is effectively sending a signal to domestic investors that the remainder has to come from internal sources. And I hosted a debate a panel discussion like this last week on the grid. It took place at the DBSA. We had on the panel someone from the presidency, Ronald Murray from Eskom, someone from Rand Merchant Bank, and someone from the PCC. And the guy from the Rand Merchant Bank made a very clear statement, which I strongly agree with based on my own research, but also my own interactions and networks, when he said, funding is not a problem. So there is significant funding. We are deep capital markets in South Africa. The total value of the retirement savings, for example, is worth 50% of the GDP. Less than 10% of that is actually invested in the real economy. The large majority circulates in paper. And even a smaller proportion of that goes into infrastructure. So I don't necessarily think that the 1.5 trillion is impossible. But when you look at the viability of the investment tickets, in particular renewables generation, that is fundable. So in other words, the combination of debt and equity without sovereign guarantees is flowing on a massive scale into those technologies in various ways, through the REAP, through the CNI investments, and 65 billion has gone onto South African rooftops in the last 3 years alone. So there's a lot of capital that can be mobilized if the institutional configurations are appropriate. I don't think that you can equate the kind of vast range of different types of investments in the grid, in rooftop solar, in CNI, in REAP, to 2 or 3 major nuclear power plants, which will be perceived as a risk, which will need sovereign guarantees, which will be difficult to insure. And I don't think these two in any way are comparable from an investment point of view.
Right.
I'm not an engineer.
All right, we've got some young people here, and there's a question from the young, and then Professor du Plessis at the back.
Hi everyone, my name is Albori Karachipizani and I'm from the Center for Sustainability Transitions. And my question is just taking it back to the just energy transition and what we're trying to do in the country. There's the reality of South Africa being the most unequal society in the world. We have the highest unemployment rates in the world. And I think you can't really give lessons without acknowledging or appreciating that context. And I'm just wondering from the nuclear side, if we're looking at upstream industrialization and creating jobs beyond just providing power to the country, what opportunities are there for industrialization when nuclear is the solution, and how accessible are they in terms of, while acknowledging that nuclear is quite a specific and dangerous, perspective-wise, technology that doesn't seem to be, that has very high barriers of entry. So what are the opportunities that nuclear would bring for the local industries?
Right. I'm going to pose that question to our two online presenters. Were there any learnings or any examples in these new build programs where that actually happened, where there was industrialization in the countries that built the new or are building the new nuclear power stations? Andy or Peter?
You go first, then I'll go second, but I'll be brief.
Yeah, I think many of those countries, particularly if you look at the UAE, they've been investing heavily in local skills programs. But from an industrialization point of view, clearly most of these new builds have come from countries who are supplying the technology. So there is limited in terms of the construction, but in terms of the servicing of the plants and the industry to support the plants, there are the opportunities that exist for doing the maintenance and so on. But initial construction now really came from the supplying countries.
Andy?
Agree.
It was very short. Professor du Plessis, there's a microphone there at the back.
Very much. I can make precisely no contribution to a discussion on the merits of the engineering of nuclear. But when we get to fiscal policy, and I can say something. And so there's another president, not mentioned yet this evening, President Truman, who said that if he was to be reincarnated, he hoped to come back as the bond market, because that really is the most powerful person in the world. And so what will stop 1 trillion from being spent on nuclear or 1.2 trillion on jet IP is the bond market. So our government does not have the fiscal capacity to add another 1.2 trillion rand of debt. That's not possible, and the bond market will stop us from doing that. Nor is it possible to get that from the private insurance industry through directed investment, or let me put it differently, to do that is a truly bad idea. So the challenge for the energy transition from a financial perspective in South Africa is not to try to find somebody with a bag full of money that adds up to 1.2 trillion rand. The idea is to create the incentives for those who currently have those assets to voluntarily invest them. So what Mark mentioned about rooftop solar is a nice example of it, and that is really the challenge for us, is to think through creating the private incentives to create alternative generating capacity, whilst the state can focus on generating the grid capacity as a public utility. But there is no 1.2 trillion drifting around that we can simply reallocate.
Right, thank you for that contribution. Professor McGregor, is there an online participant whose hand is going flashing red by now?
We have Mr. Emil Engelbrecht.
Mr. Engelbrecht, you switch on your camera.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, colleagues. I'm Emil Rain. I'm doing my PhD in electronic engineering at the moment, and I'm hoping that my energy is actually one of the reasons this event happened today. I've got two questions. One on the previous conversation of the money for Jesse. What's your take on the idea of an international monopoly on renewable energy? So, for example, if we were to get that $8.5 billion, how much of that would actually be inserted into our economy, and how much would be used for procurement from international companies to boost their own economies? And then on the conversation of the war when it comes to nuclear, it is an East versus West question. And I think Prof. Mark has got a lot of concerns that are valid, but I'm also very concerned myself of how many, I'm going to say it, white South Africans refuse to accept that Africa is leaning towards the East instead of the West. And my question is to Prof. Bismarck, why does South Africa sell neutrality, but then lean towards the East and refuse to take the West? My insider information says that we had a nuclear deal in the beginning of the year signed by President Biden that has been ignored. That's not neutrality, that's choosing the East.
Okay.
Now, I'm not going to say sides either, but South Africa is not supposed to be choosing sides. Those are my two questions.
Right, thank you very much. I mean, Jesse or Mark, who wants to take the question about will that money just flow out of South Africa to China, who's going to make all the PV panels and send them back here?
Yeah, I mean, this is a critical question. I agree. I mean, it's why I think we should have a much better designed and supported local content program. At the moment, I think about 50% of our FDI in the REAP goes to Europe. And, obviously some of that is the developers and wind and whatever, but almost all of the solar is, of course, manufactured in China, as it is for the entire world. But our capability to develop the value chain, the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan is out at the moment, and I strongly encourage everyone to have a look at it. In modular technologies is better than it is for others, I would say. I don't know if you guys want to add anything.
Right. Professor Toyboka, why are we chatting to the Russians and the Chinese and not to the, I don't know, the Koreans and some other people?
Yeah, that's an interesting question for a nuclear engineer like me, because I'm not a political scientist. But let me tell you what I know. The country, South Africa, when I was still in the sector, never ignored any of the Western powers. In fact, we undertook a trip at that time with Minister Ben Martins. And we visited the US, we visited France, we visited Korea, we visited Japan, we visited China, and the Russian Federation. And with the view of ensuring that we have a glimpse of what each of these countries are doing and how they are doing it, and what can we learn from them. And after that whole tour, world tour, we then called them here to come and present their offers to the country. And that's when you heard now about some of these vendor parades that took place at that time. But there was never a Russian deal, as far as I know. There was never a Russian deal. There was discussions with the Russians as much as there were discussions with Korea and with China. Now, if there was a deal, then we didn't know about it. I didn't know about it. Then I therefore also support the fact that it was not transparent if I did not know about it, because I was firmly a participant in the whole process. So as far as I know, there's no leaning to left or right. We're looking at which country would be best placed to give us what we want in terms of localization requirements, for example, because when we spoke about this program, the 9.6 gigawatt program, one of the things that was at the fore of the program was we want a nuclear program, not a nuclear project, meaning we are looking at the entire fuel cycle. So whoever sells us this must be able to say, we will also allow you to enter the space of fuel manufacturing and uranium enrichment, so that you are ultimately self-sufficient. Because if you had 9.6 gigawatt, that's a fleet that would be ideally placed to enable the country to localize in a large scale, which would have, of course, industrialized in a big-time kind of way. But that didn't happen. As far as I know, I haven't seen the deal. There was never a deal, in my knowledge. But there were discussions with Russia, with China, with Korea, with the US, with Japan, and of course, with the Russian Federation. So thank you.
Right, thank you. Professor McGregor, I saw Chris Yelland is really burning to ask a question. So Chris.
Thank you. I'd like to pose this question to the three panelists and to the international panelists. In the light of 50,000 megawatts to 60,000 megawatts of variable renewable energy that is planned and expected by the South African government to be on the grid by 2032 and 2033, what benefit is 2,500 megawatts of inflexible nuclear power by 2032? Surely what we need is flexible electricity generation from hydro, pump storage, battery storage, and gas to power. 2,500 megawatts of inflexible power appears completely misplaced to complement the variability of 60,000 megawatts of wind and solar power. Thank you.
And clearly you can hear that Chris is not a base loadist, as they are sometimes referred to. So I don't know, Andy, you wanna say what the contribution of 2.5 gigs of nuclear power might be to our power system?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question from Chris, and I'll answer it in two ways. I once ran production planning for Eskom. So 2,500 megawatts will not help South Africa at all, to be frank. That was one of the points that Peter Badesky and I made together, is that the country needs to say, you don't say, I'm going to dabble in a little bit of nuclear, build one more plant. I really think that there's no economy of scale in that. There is no industrial backbone that you build around that. And one either goes to 20 to 30% on nuclear, or you don't go at all. That's the sort of first part of my reply. Secondly, it is still to be shown anywhere that nuclear can do the load following. Lots of talk about significant load following in the world, but that is not the case. They generally run, for a number of reasons, run either thermal reasons or cost effectiveness reasons, run flat out. And to answer Chris's question, the supplementarity for gas and for solar and wind comes from either batteries or gas. And to be frank, batteries won't do it. It's going to be pump storage and gas for South Africa, in my view. And there, I'm very clear as a conclusion from having looked at the energy system of just about every country in the world, Chris.
Right, thank you. Peter, you want to add to Andy's answer there?
No, I think he said it. If you want to do something, you need a substantial slice of your energy system to make it work for you. The variability, SMRs in the future, going to be much more flexible and can ramp as fast as CCGTs. So that option is there, but not on the big plants. It'll have to be SMRs as we look to the future.
Okay, now, Peter, I'm just going to abuse my power as the chair here and ask you, since you've been in this business for a long time, how far into the future is these small modular reactors? Is it 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line?
I think most projects that have signed contracts to actually start work are talking late this decade or early next decade. So we're talking, 5 to 10 years away. The key issue that we're facing is licensing for the first time of some of these reactors. Building them into the regulatory framework. Some of them are quite different in the way that they operate, and so regulators are starting to scratch their heads as to how they're going to do it. I work quite closely with a company called X Energy in the US, and they've benefited from a number of the Eskom PBMR people, designers have gone along there, and they're talking at the moment of building 4 units, and they've signed the contract to build 4 units in Texas for Dow Chemicals, and they are punting to build another 4 units in the UK as a start. But those units are, as I say, end of this decade or early next decade.
Right, thank you. Andy and Peter, I'm going to ask you also for just some concluding remarks, since you also had the advantage of listening to the questions. And in the room, is there any final question anybody wants to ask here? Going once, going twice? Professor McGregor, is there still one very interesting question on your radar that we haven't? You have a question? Okay, let's first take the question, and then Craig, one final question from the online participants.
Thank you very much. Christopher Fry, Western Cape Provincial Parliament, and the chair of the Ad Hoc Committee on the Energy Crisis. My question is, obviously, regarding political will. Where is it, and how exactly are we going to do? Because I'm hearing that we don't have the money, and from what I know, and from the presentations I've been to, it's clear we don't have the money. So where is this going to come from, and how is this going to how is the political will, if it ever comes, going to change our nuclear build program and not a project? Thank you.
All right. You want to take it? Professor Theo Baker.
I'll take it, and someone can take it from there. I think it starts with that political will. Once the political will is on the table and it's quite clear, as I said again, torn from the top, then we start in earnest to explore all the funding possibilities on the table. It is not far-fetched that we could explore, for example, some of the funding options that were used by the Egyptians with Rosatom, and I'm not saying let's choose Rosatom, but I'm saying we could look at such models. We could look at the models with the Turkish and so on. But I don't think we are completely out of options here. If we have the political will, we can get the team to dive into those to work out those funding models, financing models. I have also been saying one of the things that we could do, if there was political will, of course, is to in fact create a nuclear power company outside Eskom and get the Koeberg nuclear power plant into the balance sheet of that new nuclear power company. Because if you think you can build this nuclear power plant inside Eskom with all the problems, I think it's almost impossible with a very, very difficult balance sheet that Eskom has. So I think options are there, but there must be a command from the top that says, go and get the options and bring them to cabinet for discussion. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mark. You said you also have a comment on this question?
Yeah, I mean, you can construct any scenario based on an assumption. And if you say, if there's political will, then, I very much doubt you're going to find the kind of political will that you're talking about. I can't see it at all. What you will be happy about, though, is that I predict that the next version of the Integrated Resource Plan is going to refer to nuclear in a more explicit way than the previous one. It is going to talk more aggressively about new coal. It is probably going to pull back on some of the renewables targets. And what that IRP will represent is a fundamental contradiction of where the mainstream is going, both politically, financially, and also globally. And so the question is, what will be the consequences, the political consequences of an IRP which is just out of line with the science, the financing, and the politics? And I think the answer will be, it will be kind of almost laughed at. It will be regarded as a sideshow, which is not going to fundamentally change the ballgame. The horse has bolted. It's not going to generate the kind of political settlement that is required to achieve what you're talking about. The problem, though, is that means that there isn't going to be a political settlement either about the alternative. And that's what really worries me. I think if there was a completely united front, a consolidated political settlement around an energy transition that positions South Africa globally as a world leader in the decarbonization of the global economy, in the fight for energy security, we could really be a world leader. But unfortunately, because of what's going on in the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy and the ministry there, we are not going to be able to achieve that until there's a political change.
All right, thank you for that. I'm going to say gloomy news. Professor McGregor, a final question from our online participants.
I think there's kind of two questions I'm going to combine around SMRs, and really, is now the right time for South Africa to invest in SMRs, or should we not let the global north take the financial risks of that and go through the learning curves and follow that until the costs are low? And then does South Africa really have a learning curve in the SMR space?
Right. Peter, maybe you're close enough, as you said, with X-Energy. What should South Africa's approach be to SMRs?
Yeah, I think, just balancing a large plant up with SMR technology. As I said to you, if we decided tomorrow to build a large plant, we're talking probably at least a decade and longer before that plant is ready to start providing power into the South African grid. And what I said to you just previously was, I think SMRs are also a decade away. And so I think there will be learning, there will be plants that are going to be on the line in terms of SMRs. And I think South Africa could well benefit from what comes from the SMR is a much shorter construction time and flexibility on the grid and so on. So I think, in my view, if it was me making the decisions about next nuclear, I would certainly back the SMR horse rather than a large plant. A lot less risk associated with that, and there will be people ahead of us in the queue who are going to get the first of a kind plants up and running and sort out the problem. So that's where I would put my money if I were to choose.
Right, thank you very much for that. So we've got one final question from the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. They want to do it in person, Craig? Yes. So sorry, we're just trying to find the person now.
It's Zamede Mbambo.
Zamede.
Mbambo, khuluma mfethu mamele wena.
There we go.
Good evening, good evening, Vikas and the panelists. In particular, to my former colleague, Professor Chobeka. Just a few comments regarding the topic. I think it's important just to highlight that as a department, we are pursuing nuclear as part of the energy mix. We're pursuing it in line with Decision 8 of the IRP, which directed that we must commence with the preparation of the 2,500 megawatts as it is a no-regret option. In as far as that work is concerned, is that we are busy with the preparations for the issuance of the request for proposal by the end of this financial year, in line with the ministerial commitment during the budget vote speech. We see nuclear as part of the energy mix, and it's very important, and it's going to play a central role going forward into the country as part of the solution into the JET. And there are discussions in terms of looking into repurposing some of the coal-fired power stations with the SMRs going into the future. And so the department has already started work that is developing the position paper on the small modular reactors. And there is also work that is happening wherein we're busy with the transfer of the PBMR from Eskom to NEXA, with a view to see how that work needs to be taken going forward. So there is important work that the department is doing in line with the IRP and our nuclear energy policy that directed that as a country we want to become self-sufficient in all the areas of the nuclear fuel cycle for peaceful purposes. And that's how we see nuclear going forward as a country. It's going to have a significant role that it will contribute as part of the energy mix of the country. One of the issues also that I think is important just to reflect on is that when you look into the IRP, the IRP is not either or. It's not either the 2,500 megawatts of nuclear or the Grand Inga. The department is pursuing all these as part of the energy mix. And work is at an advanced stage also with regards to the consultation on the nuclear procurement framework, wherein we are engaging different options that are being interrogated with a view to make sure that a final decision will be taken towards the procurement. And we're looking into the various funding and financing options as part of this work that is being done by the department. I'll stop there.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Mbambu, for putting that the position of the department quite clearly. So, Andy and Peter, some concluding or short concluding remarks, and then we're going to wrap up this very busy and interesting evening. Because
my first statement would be that South Africa should continue to be a proud signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There should be no link between any South African nuclear power program and the weapons program is an absolute starting point, although not addressed tonight. The second one is, from my perspective, and I understand and looked at the energy system in probably most countries of the world, South Africa's first priority is to end load shedding. That is more important than all considerations of meeting its NDC requirements, net zero requirements, or even the just energy transition. There will be no country and no economy and no society unless we can end load shedding. And whatever it takes to do that successfully needs to be the first priority. And if we as a country try to do too many things at the same time, we will fail at all of them at the same time too. And the third one is, if you were to ask me how I see both the status of international large-scale 1,000 to 1,400 megawatt reactors and the countries that can deliver them, or SMRs for that matter, or fusion, and fusion is on the even more distant horizon, then the only way that South Africa can end load shedding is to do a fast combination of renewables, batteries, and gas. And I'm very clear on that conclusion from understanding the country and the options available to it.
All right, thanks, Andy. Peter?
Yeah, I think absolutely same sentiments as Andy. As I said to you, even if you were to sign contracts tomorrow for SMRs or big reactors, that's not going to help the crisis which is facing the electricity supply industry in South Africa today. So certainly we'd need to bear what Andy said in mind. We need to focus on that as the priority. And as I said to you, long term, my view is in a decade is about the time when SMRs will be available on pretty short construction times. They will have been proven already. And for me, that's where we need to be looking for expanding the nuclear capacity of South Africa if we do go down that route.
All right, thank you very much. And I was said, I must actually give my takeaways, but I knew that there was not going to be consensus. So I'm not even going to venture and try and summarize all the different views that were brought to light here this evening. But for me, the real purpose of this evening was to have a dialogue, to hear different people bring different insights to the discussion. And I think we've been quite successful in doing that with very little, if any, grandstanding done. So thank you very much for the colleagues on that. I think we all walk away here with something to think about, something to consider, and hopefully as a country we can go forward. Because if there's one thing that I agree with both Dave and Andy, is that we need electricity on the grid sooner rather than later to keep the economy going and also for the quality of life of all our citizens. So with that, I'm going to thank STIAS for hosting and co-sponsoring the event. I want to thank our 5 panelists, the 2 in London and the 3 here in Stellenbosch. Thank you very much for making your time available and your insightful contributions. We also want to say it's recognized that the South African government and Eskom may need to decide if nuclear power is an option to pursue and if to expand the future nuclear capacity in South Africa. And in order to do that, they need to ask for proposals in the foreseeable future, which we heard from the DMRE is definitely coming up. And I hope that we have provided input to a broad range of stakeholders on how this may play out. So the Stellenbosch participants are now invited to continue the discussion over a glass of wine and some snacks. Unfortunately, Uber Eats didn't want to contribute everything to all our online participants, but thank you very much, especially for the people that are stuck for what is now nearly 2.5 hours in this discussion online. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you very much for everybody that is here. Good night and travel safely.
Thank you.
Thank you.